The burlap itched against her cheek, but Junie didn't dare move. Not even when her little brother whimpered in his sleep beside her, his knees pulled to his chest, his fingers wrapped around her braid like a rope he could hold onto in the dark. Above them, boot heels struck the wooden platform like thunder searching for lightning. Men grumbled. Metal clinked. Laughter rang sharp as broken glass. Somewhere, a bottle shattered. But no one looked down. They never looked down. Junie counted breaths. Her own. Her brother's. The stranger's. She'd learned how to measure danger by breath. Short ones meant drunkenness. Heavy ones meant hunger. And the shallow ones, the ones that hovered at the edge of speech but never spoke, those meant something worse. 3 crates away, the auctioneer started calling out the next name. Someone coughed. A boy was dragged by the arm and made to stand under a flickering lantern. He looked 12, maybe less. He didn't cry. Junie held Toby tighter under the sack, her small palm over his mouth as he stirred. If he cried out now, if he even sneezed, someone would see them. And she couldn't bear to be seen. The sack had once held potatoes. Now it held what was left of her world. Her mama used to say, "The Lord sees in secret." But Mama wasn't here. And secrets didn't keep you safe. Not in Ironwood. The town square was lit by 2 oil lamps and a sliver of moon. The buildings leaned like old men who'd forgotten their prayers. Wind teased at torn signs. A dry cough of dust swept across the street. But inside the circle of that platform, it was a different kind of cold. The kind that came from eyes that judged and hands that took. A grizzled man stepped forward and tossed a coin. "I'll take the big one." "Got strong arms." Another voice muttered. "Too pretty. Won't last a week." Junie flinched. Her heart thumped like a trapped bird's. Toby stirred. His mouth moved against her shoulder. "Mama." Junie's hand flew to his lips again, her voice barely air. "Close your eyes," she whispered, her lips against his forehead. "Mama's coming." She didn't believe it. But he did. That was all that mattered. 2 months ago, Mama had coughed blood into a rag and told Junie to run. She'd run until her feet bled and Toby cried himself hoarse. They'd been caught, sold, lost, found again, then left in the back of a wagon that reeked of lie and sweat. Somewhere along the line, the man who'd traded them for whiskey forgot to tie the latch. They ran again. Junie never looked back. Until now. A hush settled. The auctioneer cleared his throat. A wooden cane tapped the edge of the platform. Junie risked a peek. Her eye met the worn boot of someone who wasn't moving. She froze. Toby breathed too loudly. The boot stepped forward. Junie's heart stopped. Then nothing. No voice. No barked command. No yanking sack. Just silence. Then the rustle of cloth. A coin clinked on wood. Once. Then twice. Junie dared another look. A woman stood there, still as the moon. She wore a long black dress, buttoned to her throat. Her face was pale, angular, almost stone-like in the lantern light. But her eyes weren't looking at the sack. They were looking through it. The auctioneer, caught mid-spit, grunted. "They ain't listed. What are you buyin'?" The woman said nothing. She placed her gloved hand over the coins, slid them forward, and spoke in a voice softer than dust on a windowsill. "They're mine." A laugh rippled through the crowd. "Ain't how it works, missy." The woman tilted her head, as if bored. "No child here asked for how it works." And with that, she knelt. Junie held her breath so hard her chest burned. But the woman didn't reach for them. She simply waited. "I'm not a man," the woman murmured, almost to herself. "I don't take what's not given." Then she stood again and turned her back to the sack. Something in that moment broke open inside Junie. Maybe it was the silence. Or the way the woman looked away as if she didn't need to look to see. Or maybe it was because, for the first time, no one was reaching. Toby wriggled. "I wanna go, Junie." And that was it. Junie pushed the sack off their heads. Dust filled her nose. She blinked up. The woman was already halfway to a wagon hitched beneath a dying elm tree. She paused, not turning. Junie stood on numb feet, pulling Toby up with her. The crowd murmured, but no one stopped them. The coins still lay where the woman had placed them. Junie didn't look back as they stumbled after her, barefoot and shaking. She wasn't sure if they were being saved or stolen again. But for now, the sack lay empty, and the road was open. The wagon creaked like it hadn't moved in years. A faded patchwork blanket covered the seat. The mule, no horse, looked as old as the mountains, but it didn't protest when the woman lifted Toby into her arms and set him beside her. Then she looked at Junie. Her green eyes were like river water just before it freezes. Not cruel, not warm, just still. Junie hesitated, then climbed in beside her brother. The woman didn't speak again. Not when she flicked the reins. Not when they passed Myrtle's bakery and the sheriff's shuttered office. Not even when Toby leaned his head against her arm. Junie stared at the hem of the woman's dress. It was patched, plain, but clean. She smelled faintly of lavender and firewood. And tears. The widow was crying. Not loudly. Not in grief. The kind of crying you do when the world goes quiet and you remember something too old to forget. Junie didn't reach for her. But she didn't move away, either. They left the town behind before the sun even touched the hills. The sky above them went from ink to bruised purple. Junie glanced at the road ahead. Empty. Winding. Then back at the sack they'd left behind, slowly flapping in the breeze like a flag of surrender. It didn't matter where they were going. Only that someone had left the door open. And waited. Junie closed her eyes. Mama's coming. Mama's coming. The words pulsed in her chest like the last beat of a lullaby. Toby whispered in his sleep. The widow wiped her face with her gloved hand. And the road kept going. The house stood at the edge of the world. Or at least that's how it felt. Its roof leaned slightly to the left, like it had grown tired of holding itself upright for too long. The porch steps sagged in the middle. The shutters didn't match. A few dead vines still clung to the frame, brittle as old bones. But it was clean. And it waited, like a breath held between two sobs. The wagon creaked to a stop beside the fence. No welcome sign. No chickens pecking in the dirt. Just silence and wind. Even the tree behind the house, half dead and stripped of leaves, seemed to bow in quiet. Temperance didn't speak as she stepped down, boots crunching over frostbitten grass. She reached for Toby first. He'd slept through most of the ride, arms wrapped around her arm like it belonged to him. He barely blinked as she carried him inside, head still heavy with sleep. Junie hesitated on the porch. The sky was a deep copper behind her, the kind that made you feel like something was ending. Maybe it was. She touched the splintered post beside her, waiting for the door to swing shut and lock. It didn't. Temperance came back, held the door open, looked at her, not like a command, not like an invitation. Just a stillness that asked nothing and waited for everything. Junie stepped inside. The air smelled of ash, lavender, and something warm beneath. The hearth glowed faintly. A kettle hissed. There were only 2 chairs. One was by the window, the other tucked beside a wooden table stained with time and quiet meals. A single photograph hung above the mantel, a man in preacher's black, stiff-backed and unsmiling. His eyes looked past the camera. Or maybe past the woman who once stood beside him. Toby was already curled on a rag rug, thumb in his mouth, half covered in the same patchwork blanket from the wagon. His feet poked out like roots that hadn't figured out where to grow yet. Temperance moved without noise. She poured something into a chipped blue cup and set it on the table. Broth. Maybe tea. Junie couldn't tell. Her stomach cramped at the smell. She didn't sit. She stood behind the chair like she wasn't sure she deserved it anymore. Junie didn't speak. Neither did she. Outside, the wind scratched the windows. Inside, nothing moved but the flame. Later, when Toby finally slept deeper and Junie's head began to tilt from hunger and weariness, Temperance laid a folded quilt across her lap. Not over her. Not like she owned her. Just a gift with no ribbon. Junie accepted it like a question she didn't know how to answer. That night, they didn't sleep in the back room. They curled near the hearth, side by side. Junie kept her fingers lightly on Toby's shirt to be sure he was still there. The woman didn't take the bed either. She sat in the rocker and watched the fire go out. When morning came, it was snowing. Junie opened her eyes to gray light and a quiet so complete it felt like a held breath. She looked around. The woman was gone. Then the back door creaked. Temperance entered with a small basket of kindling, her shawl dusted with snowflakes. She stomped her boots, not loudly, but like she didn't care if anyone heard anymore. She caught Junie staring. Didn't smile. But she nodded. The stove groaned. The scent of cornmeal and eggs rose like memory. Toby stirred. Then hiccuped. He sat up blinking, hair sticking to one cheek. Temperance poured water into a basin and handed him a cloth. Not a word passed between them. But somehow, the air filled anyway. Junie helped with the plates. They didn't match. The knife was dull. The salt dish was cracked down one side. But it was the first table they'd sat at in weeks. Toby kicked his feet happily and spilled milk. Temperance didn't flinch. By the end of the week, the girl had learned how to carry wood and the boy how to feed the chickens. Temperance never raised her voice. Never asked for thanks. Never touched without reason. But one morning, Junie found 3 lengths of string nailed to the doorframe. One marked high. One halfway. One at her shoulder. She stared. The girl knew measuring sticks. Mama used to mark them in wagon posts. But this felt different. This felt like something new was being built, without telling them it was being built. Later that day, Temperance placed a rusted tin cup filled with wild grass on the windowsill. Junie added a single red button she found under the rug. No one spoke of it. The next evening, Temperance opened the trunk in the corner. She pulled out an old wool vest, lined in faded blue, and began sewing. Her needle moved slowly, like a hymn whispered for someone long buried. She cut it into 2 small coats, one rougher, one softer. When she pricked her finger, Junie rushed forward and wrapped it in a torn strip from her apron. The cloth was pale blue, almost the same as the ribbon Temperance had pulled from that trunk before and folded away. She stared at it. Didn't thank her. Didn't speak. But later, Junie found the ribbon tied neatly around her pillow. The girl began to speak more. Not much. Just enough. She asked about the orchard once, why it had no apples. Temperance said, not everything that blooms bears fruit. Junie didn't understand, but she liked how it sounded. One day, a woman from the village came riding up. Her name was Myrtle Cade. She wore too much lace and perfume that chased the air out of the room. She called Temperance dear and widow in the same sentence, and her eyes slid to the children like flies to pie. They say you plucked them from auction like berries from a bush. That true. Temperance didn't flinch. They were left. Left ain't free. You know that. Law don't smile on strays, dear. They're not strays. Myrtle raised a brow. And what are they, then? Temperance looked at Junie. Then at Toby. She said nothing. Myrtle huffed and muttered something about grief makes women odd. She left in a huff of skirts and peppermint. Junie watched the window until the dust settled. Temperance stood at the sink, hands in water, face turned away. Are we gonna have to go? Junie asked, barely above a whisper. Temperance didn't answer. Not until later that night, after the children had dozed, their hair damp from washing and their feet finally warm beneath real blankets. She sat beside the hearth, one hand open on her lap. If I ever tell you to leave, she murmured, not looking at anyone, remind me of today. The wind picked up outside. It sighed through the cracks like a song with no words. Toby whimpered once in sleep. Junie whispered a clapping rhyme against her palm, soft and slow. Their mama used to sing it in spring when fireflies lit up their tent. This time, Temperance joined in. Not the words. Just the hum. It was off-key, but steady. Later, when everyone slept and the coals began to fade, Junie rolled over to find a thin apple blossom resting on her chest. Wilted, but still white. It hadn't snowed that day. She looked toward the back door. It was open a crack, and barefoot tracks led back from the orchard. Snow fell again, slow as sifted flour, covering the bent porch rail, the crooked fence, and the half-dead orchard like someone trying to forget. Toby pressed his nose to the frosted window pane, making little clouds with his breath. Junie was on the floor, stitching buttons onto a scrap of cloth that might one day be called a doll. Temperance stirred the fire with a metal poker, her shawl still draped over one shoulder. The shawl never left her, not even when the stove made the room too warm, not even when the children pressed against her side as if trying to melt their way into her ribs. Outside, the world had gone white. Inside, it was beginning to warm. Toby now called her Miss Wren with his soft, round voice, though sometimes he forgot and called her Mama in his sleep. Junie never corrected him, and Temperance never flinched when it happened. Every morning, Junie placed something new on the windowsill, a pine cone, a stone, a bent feather. A shrine of small, sacred things. Things she could not keep before. Things someone might now protect. Temperance added nothing. But once, Junie caught her gently dusting the shelf with her sleeve, careful not to disturb a single object. The girl began sweeping without being told. The boy helped hang laundry even when his hands shook from the cold. No one asked. No one thanked. It was just what grew in the quiet between them. One afternoon, while mending the second coat she'd sewn from her husband's old vest, Temperance looked up and saw Junie curled on the rug, reading aloud from a water-damaged Bible. Her lips moved slowly, stumbling over the harder parts. Toby snored beside her. Temperance listened for a long time before she realized Junie had stopped. "You believe in heaven?" the girl asked. The fire snapped. Temperance leaned back. "Some days." Junie turned a page. "Mama said babies go there, even if they're not born." Temperance's hands paused on the fabric. "Your mama was right." A long silence bloomed between them. Then Junie said, "Did you have one?" It wasn't the kind of question a child meant to ask, but the kind grief asked through them. Temperance looked at her lap, then the coat in her hands. She folded it neatly. "She was born quiet," she said, "and stayed that way." Junie didn't speak. She only nodded. That was all the woman needed. Later that week, Temperance began teaching Junie how to shape dough. The girl's hands were clumsy at first, too much flour, too little press, but she learned. Toby sat on the counter with flour on his nose, humming to himself. That evening, the kitchen filled with the smell of fresh bread. It had been years since it had. When night came, Temperance pulled a book of hymns from a high shelf. She set it on the table, open to a page marked by a pressed violet. Her finger traced the faded ink. She hummed the first verse, barely above breath. Junie joined in on the second. Toby, too young to know the words, tapped the rhythm on the table like it was a game he half remembered. Afterward, they sat in the hush that followed song, full but still. But warmth has a way of drawing notice. 3 days later, a letter came. It was pinned to the fence post with a rusty nail, the envelope warped from snow. Temperance found it early, before the children stirred. She didn't open it right away. She sat on the porch instead, watching the trees shake off their frost. When she finally tore it open, her hands were steady, but her eyes were not. A complaint had been filed by the auctioneer, unauthorized removal of minors from public custody. A date was set for review. She read it twice, then burned it in the stove before the sun rose. When Junie asked what the smell was, Temperance said, "Just old paper. Didn't need it anymore." But the quiet returned like a ghost with no name. She stopped humming. She no longer added wood to the fire unless the children asked. That night, she sat in the rocker until her knuckles turned white on the arms. Junie watched her from the hallway, not speaking. The next morning, Junie dragged the broken cradle out from the attic. It had been wrapped in a moth-eaten quilt, pushed behind boxes, forgotten. One of the legs was cracked. The lace was yellowed and curled like old parchment. She set it in the kitchen, near the hearth. Temperance found it before breakfast. She didn't ask how it got there. She simply sat down beside it and began to mend it, one splinter at a time. That evening, the children drew on brown paper with charred ends of firewood. Toby drew a crooked house. Junie drew 3 figures. 1 tall, 2 small, all holding hands. Temperance didn't look at it until they were asleep. She folded the paper and placed it in the hymn book, between "Abide with me" and "Come thou fount." The next day, snow fell again. But this time, the children were ready. Their coats fit. Their boots held fast. Temperance taught them how to salt the steps so no one would fall. Later, they built a snow woman with button eyes and a stick arm that held a wooden spoon. Temperance watched from the porch, arms crossed, face unreadable. Then Junie turned toward her and smiled. The kind of smile that didn't ask for anything. The kind that offered something instead. Temperance stepped down into the snow. She picked up another stick. Helped make the second snow woman. This one had a blue ribbon tied around its neck. Junie's ribbon. They didn't speak. But something opened. And something else settled in. That night, Junie woke from a dream and wandered into the kitchen. Temperance was already there, hands cupped around a mug of warm milk. The fire had nearly gone out. "Can't sleep?" Temperance asked. Junie shook her head. Her voice was hoarse. "Don't want to wake up and be back there." "You won't. But they might come. They might. What'll we do?" Temperance took a slow sip, then leaned down and brushed Junie's hair back. "We'll remember what we built," she said. Junie frowned. "But it's just snow." "No." Temperance looked toward the back door, where the cradle now stood beneath a blanket of quilts. "It's more than snow. It's what grows in winter." Junie pressed her forehead to Temperance's side, and for the first time she whispered, "Mama." Temperance didn't answer. She just wrapped her arms around her and let the silence answer for her. The next morning, Junie awoke to the sound of boots in the yard. Voices. The sheriff's voice. And Myrtle's. Toby still slept. But Junie stood, eyes wide, heart thudding. Temperance had already set the table. And laid out 3 plates. Without trembling. The snow hadn't stopped since midnight. By morning, it buried the fence posts and softened the path to the porch until even memory lost its shape. Wind rattled the windows like a beggar asking to be let in, and the hearth burned low, tired, uncertain. Temperance stood at the stove, back straight, face still. The kettle hissed. She placed 3 plates on the table with quiet precision, each one centered, each one waiting. Her hands didn't shake, but Junie could see the tightness in her knuckles, the way her jaw was set like a lock with no key. The boots outside didn't rush. That was worse somehow. 2 men and 1 woman. 1 set of spurs. 1 too light voice that didn't belong on this land. Junie sat on the bench beside Toby, clutching the hem of her coat. She dressed him slowly this morning, buttoning each clasp, smoothing his hair with wet fingers. Not because he needed it, but because it gave her something to do with her fear. Toby chewed a piece of bread, unaware. He hummed a tune, one Temperance had hummed once weeks ago when the world had softened for a moment. Then the knock came. Not loud, but final. Temperance didn't flinch. She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the room. Her boots made no sound. When she opened the door, cold bled into the room like a ghost let loose. Sheriff Edgar Hatch stood on the porch, his hat pulled low, his mouth pressed into a line that tried to hide apology. Behind him stood Myrtle Cade, cheeks red with righteousness, and a man in a long brown coat, tall, thin, forgettable in every way but his eyes. His eyes were sharp as frozen nails. Temperance looked at them without moving. Her shawl hung loosely now, slipping from one shoulder. "You got my letter," she said. The sheriff nodded. Myrtle stepped forward. "We're here for the children." Junie grabbed Toby's hand. The man in brown pulled a paper from his coat, but didn't unfold it. Complaint was filed. Custody in question. 2 minors. No kin. No license. No legal claim. Temperance stepped aside. "Come in, then." Junie's heart dropped. Toby looked up at her, confused. The three entered. Snow crackled on their boots. Myrtle looked around the home like a judge walking through a trial. The sheriff tipped his hat at the children, then looked away quickly, as if afraid eye contact might make this harder. Temperance didn't offer tea. She didn't sit. She simply stood between the children and the fire. "You see them," she said. "You've walked in and seen them. What do you see?" The man in brown cleared his throat. "Two children under unlawful care." "No," she interrupted softly. "That's what you came expecting. I asked what you see." The man faltered. "They're clean," Myrtle said briskly. "Warm. Federal. But that ain't the question." Temperance stepped closer. "No bruises. No fear. No hunger. They're not hiding under sacks anymore. They sleep through the night. They laugh. He draws. She prays." Her voice wavered, once. "I don't beat them. I don't sell them. I don't take from them. I let them stay." "They're not yours," Myrtle snapped. "They weren't yours either," Temperance said softer. "And yet you let them be auctioned like meat." A silence fell. Only the hiss of the kettle remained. The sheriff looked toward Junie, then back at the man in brown. "She's right," he muttered. "They're better off." "It's not about better," the man said stiffly. "It's about right. And written law." Temperance's face shifted, just slightly. A look of old weariness washed through her, like something long buried had stirred beneath her ribs. She stepped to the hearth and lifted a small wooden box from beneath the floorboards. Inside was a folded paper, weathered, crinkled. She opened it slowly, her fingers steady. "My name is Temperance Wren, widow of Thomas Wren, preacher of Ironwood Parish. This deed," she held it high, "names me as sole occupant of this land. There is no church left. There is no husband. Only me. And two children who had nowhere to go but under God's sky and into my care." "That doesn't make you their mother," Myrtle said, arms crossed. Temperance looked at her. Not angry. Not pleading. Just tired. "No. It makes me someone who stayed." She knelt by Junie then, smoothing the girl's coat. "Tell them what you want." Junie looked from face to face. The sheriff. The man in brown. Myrtle. "I want to stay," she whispered. Toby mimicked her. "We wanna stay." The room swelled with quiet. The sheriff stepped forward, took off his hat, scratched the back of his neck like a man unsure which side he was meant to be on. The man in brown looked down at his paper, then at the children, then at Temperance. "She broke a rule," Myrtle said again. The man sighed. "Sometimes rules get broken before the world does." He folded the paper. The air shifted. The sheriff gave a short nod. Myrtle stormed out first, her boots crunching fast and hard. The man in brown hesitated. "We won't file this." Temperance met his eyes. "Don't come back." He tipped his head. "I hope we don't have to." Then they were gone. The snow took them. The door closed. And for a long time, no one moved. Then Toby ran to Temperance and wrapped his arms around her leg. She lifted him without a word, holding him against her chest like a lost limb returning. Junie stood frozen, tears unshed, breath caught. Temperance opened one arm. Junie stepped into it. They stood like that by the hearth, a strange, silent monument of survival. Later that night, Temperance knelt by the half-dead tree at the edge of the orchard. Junie watched from the porch. She held something in her hand. A ribbon. Pale blue. She buried it in the snow beneath the roots. Not to forget, but to plant. When she stood, the sky was turning the faintest color of ash. A hush covered everything. Then, through the trees, just before dawn returned, a single blossom opened. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.